All right, good morning, everyone. My name is Alexandra Porter, and I'll be introducing the topic of today's webinar, which is how to mitigate food insecurity as it relates to commuter students and creating a safe cashless campus experience during COVID-19. So to get right into it, let's see. So some of the intended takeaways that we hope that you will learn from this session is number one, a food insecurity mitigation solution. Number two, a commuter meal plan growth strategy. Number three, a financially viable revenue-based strategy. And finally, number four, a COVID-19 cashless campus solution. To introduce our hosts for today, we have David Porter, who's the author and founder of Porter Consulting, and as well we have Mike Clear, who's the co-founder of Watchman Payment Solutions, and myself, Alexandra Porter. As many of you might know, Porter Consulting is one of North America's premier strategic planning and design firms. We've been on over 400 colleges and universities over the past 49 years with 11 team members and many of the provinces of Canada. And to pass it off, we'll turn it to David Porter so that he can get the webinar going.
Thanks, Alex. Actually, that 49 years, we've been in business now for 25 years. I've been in the food service realm, operations consulting and the like for the past 49 years. And 5 years ago, we wrote a book called The Porter Principles. And an important part of that book had to do with meal plans and the role meal plans play on college and university campuses. They're all, meal plans are usually synonymous with residential dining room and board, but we've also come up with some strategies over the past 30 years that we want to talk about today about commuter meal plans for community colleges as well as four-year schools that have a significant commuter student population. It's always important when we undertake planning and develop solutions to understand who our target markets are. And for this presentation, we're really going to focus on the students. Food insecure students, 67% of community college students are food insecure. Most of us know that that's a serious problem. It always has been, probably is even going to be more amplified now during this COVID crisis. Also, homeless students, community college or commuter homeless students. There is unfortunately a significant percentage of students who are homeless. Just last fall, we were doing some planning for a system in Milwaukee, and I did focus groups with the students. Some of those students actually lived in tents off campus. They were homeless and they came to campus to get an education. So it's a serious problem, and food insecurity clearly is central to their lives. And as well as housing insecure students. Now, I'm not talking about residential housing, I'm talking about housing off campus. What I've found out over the past 20 or 30 years is that there's really a significant distinction between off-campus commuter students, even on a four-year school. So for example, when we've facilitated focus groups on four-year schools, one comes to mind in New Hampshire, when I interviewed the commuter students, they kind of fell into two categories. And the two categories were one where maybe they lived in apartments or maybe even at home off campus, but they had, some resources. They were okay financially. But there was another group of commuter students who really were at the other end of the spectrum, where they lived at home, but a lot of their life also revolved around trying to help mom or dad or whomever they were living with pay the electric bill or pay the rent or help contribute to groceries. And they were really, really strapped financially. So there is a distinction, and we want to address those in terms of those housing insecure. And this also applies to just about any socioeconomic background, but we want to address these categories most importantly. So I want to start framing this conversation today. Most of this discussion we're having at least the what we're describing as the opportunity to meet those 4 objectives really has to do with the past 30 years. I began my consulting career in 1990 with a focus in college and university dining. We started this company in 1995. And probably I would say close to 23 years ago, this was a real head scratcher for me. I was actually doing focus groups at a VOTEC, a 2-year VOTEC in Helena, Montana. And when I was interviewing these students, they were single moms, welfare to work type programs, clearly individuals that were strapped financially. But the head scratcher was during the focus groups, they were asking me if we could have meal plans. And I was just a little bit shocked by that. It's hard enough to sell meal plans or entice students on just about any kind of campus to buy a voluntary meal plan of any kind of significance. And the second part of their question or their request had to do with, can we use our Pell Grant money to fund that meal plan purchase? And the way they described it to me was that, and they were very open about the fact that they were not good managers of their money. And at the end of the either a 2 or a 4-week period at the beginning of their semester, most of them got some money back that was not used for Pell in the form of a check. At least that's the way it was 23 or 24 years ago. And they basically said, you know, Mr. Porter, we just go out and blow it. But we would love to have the opportunity in the bookstore or somehow on campus to use some of that Pell Grant money before it gets refunded to us to buy some kind of food-only card or declining balance, put that money in a declining balance account that we could use for food that could help us get through the next month or 2 months or either part or all of the semester. So for my thinking, that's really where this seed was planted in terms of creating an opportunity for commuter students to buy into that. Also, probably about 18 years ago, I was on a campus in Georgia, and it was a 4-year school. And at the end of one of the focus groups we had, again, we had a cross-section of resident and commuter students. This young lady came up to me and said, you know, Mr. Porter, is there any way we can use our food stamps for our meal plan? So this is something that is clearly not new. It's been an issue for many, many years. The overall issue of food insecurity certainly seems to be more prominent in all of our minds, especially over the last couple of years, and even more so right now in this COVID crisis. So I want to talk a minute about what we consider an important part of the value component for meal plans. Now, residential meal plans, probably one of the most important value components is the payment source. So most meal plans, as part of a room and board contract, if they're mandatory anyway, are usually funded by either family support and or financial aid or a combination of the two. And there are occasions when the student actually works part-time and saves up and pays for their own education and their own expenses. But I would say the majority of the time, it's one of those two sources. And not to minimize or belittle it, but in my mind, sometimes I think of that as funny money. And I don't mean, you know, laughable funny. I mean, it's when a student doesn't have to reach into his or her pocket to take out $11 in cash to actually pay for a lunch or pay for the door rate, whether it's an all-you-care-to-eat facility or even a retail facility on a campus where there's more declining balance as part of the meal plans as a method of payment. You know, cash is king. Students prize it, they protect it, they want to spend it on what they want to spend it on. And usually it's not something they either have or want to spend on feeding themselves 2 or 3 meals a day. So again, the funding source, the payment source is a really important part of what makes a meal plan potentially so potent and so valuable. So let's look at commuter meal plans. Clearly, the commuter meal plan has always been a challenge because what's the incentive for a student to take money out of his or her checking or savings account and just put it in a declining balance account and spend it that way, as opposed to just spending the cash or bringing something from home. I know some states, if you have a meal plan, you are tax exempt. So in some cases, like the state of New York, you don't have to pay sales tax if you do put the money in a meal plan account, even if it's cash that you're putting in as a commuter student. However, we think even a more compelling source goes back to that conversation I had with those students 23 years ago, and the ability to use Pell Grants and or some form of financial aid, or even SNAP or food stamp money. And Mike Clear, our co-host here, is going to talk about that in just a minute. We actually have a client we were celebrating recently because in Milwaukee, they do permit this. So a student at the Milwaukee Area Technical College in Milwaukee can go to the bookstore and have $150 of Pell Grant money put onto a declining balance food-only account. Now that account, then a student can go to the food court, get that activated, and that money can be spent on campus, only in the on-campus food service locations. And that's what we think creates a tremendous value and a tremendous opportunity for giving 60 or 70 or 80 or 90% of some universities' students that get Pell Grant money and other forms of financial aid to actually use that as a method of payment. You know, sometimes we hear the argument that, you know, some of these scholarships or Pell Grant money in some jurisdictions or states, you cannot use it on food or for food. But I would argue, and I will argue till the cows come home, that meals are just as important. Healthy food choices are just as important to the success of a student academically as a textbook is. You know, I go to a lot of conferences every year, or at least we used to prior to COVID. I've got a colleague in the bookstore business who's a bookstore consultant, and I've often kind of joked to him. I said, let's put our booths next to each other and put a sign up and say, which of these services or amenities or requirements can a student live without in order to be successful while they're on campus? So certainly textbooks are almost universally a part of financial aid, including Pell Grant. We think meals are equally of importance to the student's success. So let's shift gears here for a minute to the revenue-based discussion that Alex alluded to earlier. So just to give everybody a sense as to what we're talking about in terms of order of magnitude and monies, if we drop to that last line, so for example, if we said we want a student to put $224 onto a meal plan account, a commuter student at the beginning of the semester, I mean, that 224 is a pretty daunting number for most students to consider dedicating to food only. But let's break it down on a daily basis. And let's just further break it down to say, okay, it's a community college, which are typically, 3 or 4 day a week propositions, sometimes 5, sometimes 4.5. But let's just say 4 days a week. Let's assume there are 16 weeks in a semester. So if we did 1 coffee a day, and I just used, I get a large, extra large Dunkin' Donuts coffee. It's about $3.50, give or take, depending on what I put in it. 1 large coffee a day times 4 days a week at $3.50 times 16 weeks. And if we took a number of 5,000 students, some schools have 1,000 or 500 commuter students. Some schools have 20,000. Community college have commuter students. We've got clients in Canada, University of Ottawa, and York University that have between 45 and 48 or 9,000 commuter students. That's right, 48 or 49,000 commuter students. So if all we took is 5,000, $3.50 a day, 4 days a week, 16 weeks a semester, that's about times 5,000 is $2.4 million a year in revenue associated with 1 cup of coffee a day for 5,000 students. And I think if we present it in the form of $224, it seems a little bit daunting. if we present it in the form of $3.50 4 days a week, and that's just using that as an example, that could all be used in one day for lunch and a dinner and a breakfast. So if we wanted to spread it out, give it an order of magnitude, and right size the actual gravity of the financial commitment, it seems pretty practical. Let's take it up a notch. Recently, last fall, we did some work at the Montgomery County Community College system in Montgomery County, Maryland, 4 campuses. One of those campuses had a little over 16,000 students, FTEs. Well, the average check in a food court on a community college campus can easily be between $9.50 or $9.75 and $12. Matter of fact, on a particular campus, one of those systems in the fall, it was about $10 or $10.50. So for one lunch a day, 4 days a week, 16 weeks a semester, it potentially is a $6.7 million a year revenue base. Now, $672 a semester is really daunting if you look at that kind of money. But when you think of it on a daily basis, whether that money has to be pre-deposited within the first 30 days, or as Mike will explain to you in a minute, how it could be continually accessed as a method of payment throughout the semester. Again, we think this is a tremendous opportunity, provides an opportunity for students not to be food insecure, to be able to have some good nourishment so they can study and retain and not worry about where their next meal is going to come from. So they stay in school, they graduate from school, they excel academically, and they're successful once they graduate. Now, if we want to kind of go for the gold here, let's just say we're talking about breakfast, which could be a cup of coffee and a bagel and cream cheese, or a croissant, or maybe an egg sandwich of some kind, and lunch, and then maybe a late afternoon snack or a meal. Again, here we are at over $13 million a year as a revenue base, as an opportunity, and 4 days a week, 16 weeks a semester times 5,000 students. And these are just examples, but I think they're good examples to really convey the financial revenue base construct potential, but also how this kind of, what the daily cost is, and the value to a student if they have access to these different forms of scholarship money as they decide to go about making purchases on a day-to-day basis. So now I've just kind of described to everybody what we consider the what, and what Mike here, and I wish Mike was, maybe Mike was around 30 years ago, but you know, it's been worth the wait, because Mike has developed a great system that can actually permit all of this to come to life in real time. So Mike, I'll pass it over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, David, and thank you for inviting us to be a part of this presentation, as well as everyone who's attending. I really appreciate you taking the time to see what we're up to. As David said, I work with a couple other guys and gals over at Watchman Payment Systems. I wasn't in the space 30 years ago, but I've got about 15 years of experience in point of sale and student information systems on college campuses. Started back in the bookstore space and have evolved into other auxiliaries and enterprises. And I'm happy to have the opportunity to chat with you guys today, and hopefully maybe some ongoing discussions about this in the future, about how we can potentially work together to make student financial aid more accessible on commuter campuses and even four-year institutions with our process. So at a high level, you know, when you think about what do we do, or why is this important, I think it's important to kind of think back to the source, the funding types, or the monies that we're looking at or that we're talking about. And you know, I have a couple of friends and family members who are in the financial market space, and they always tell me when they start meeting with a client or a new customer, they actually go through, you know, the definition of money, which I'm not going to do today, but I think it is important to define the fund source or fund type that we're looking at, and understand how much of it is available or accessible. So, you know, typically I think people think about financial aid and they assume, oh, it's gone, you know, the tuition consumes it all, or housing consumes it all, or whatever the biggest expenditures are on your campus. And we find that not to be the case. We have, as I mentioned, you know, several years in the space. We have over 150 customers. We've ran some studies in the past couple of years, over 130 of our colleges that use our platform. And we studied specifically the bookstore space, but I think it's relevant across the board. And what we learned is that rarely are the financial aid funds exhausted by tuition, housing, and other fees. And we also learned that 75% of all students have some form of financial assistance. It doesn't matter what socioeconomic strata they're in. If they're on the higher end or upper middle class versus someone who's a little bit more strapped for cash, they may have a different variety of fund types, being more federal for the lower income individuals and more private for the higher income individuals. But by and large, most students do use this. And what we see, and I wouldn't say that there's a causation between these numbers. If you recall from one of David's slides, the cup of coffee example, that spend was $224 per term. But from our research, we did see that our typical bookstore would see an increase of expenditure of $220 per enrollee on campus. So that's just an average of all students and the total dollars spent through our process of a variety of different financial aid sources. And I often talk to that or speak to that number as a revenue opportunity, because if you don't provide access to these funds, you may be limiting your overall bottom line or contribution to your auxiliaries or enterprises on campus, because that fund type just doesn't exist for you. Almost similar to saying, oh, we don't accept credit cards. Well, you're going to limit yourself to a lesser customer base. So our goal here at the end of the day is not all revenue, but really to provide students with a head start, without supplanting your current distribution methods. We're not asking your financial aid office to change how they do everything. And I think that's an important thing to note. If you do take this back to your campus, I advise you not to go at it alone. Bring us to the table so that we don't trigger someone in the financial aid office with a comment or a term that just makes them think this is a non-starter. In fact, our goal is generally to parallel your existing process in a way that will make this work better. So how can we help today? What do we do? Well, aside from these bullet points, which I'll briefly go through, I think the easiest way to explain what we do is just like when you accept a credit card at your register, you don't necessarily care who issued the card or if it's a points or loyalty card or what the back end rules are for that card. You just swipe it, or the retailer or merchant at the counter swipes it, and if it's approved, the transaction goes through, and if it's not, it doesn't. And there's a lot of complexity behind that process that the credit card industry has managed to abstract away. And we essentially do that same thing just for a wide variety of student financial aid types, whether they're federal or sponsored account types across your campus. So what do we do with that? Well, we have an integrated point of sale solution that your campus retail can utilize in order to add student financial aid as an additional tender type at your campus. We have a turnkey tablet solution that is accessible for folks who maybe have a point of sale or a system on campus that's not super high tech. Maybe it's just still a cash register that's not integrated, but they'd like to be able to have this capability. So we have the tablet, which serves as a sidecar. I'd say by and large, the customers of ours who use our tablet do it as a stopgap while we're configuring with their point of sale, but it's also a solution that can be used independent of a point of sale integration. We have a gift card provisioning solution, which has been pretty interesting during the COVID crisis. I guess a good case in point for this is a lot of schools have student dining programs or have received grants funds or CARES Act monies to support students through student financial aid means for dining. And how do you deliver that? If your dining hall is closed, you could have students go through an online process and maybe mail them a gift card, or you could have them show up at a parking lot and give them a card to take to an off-campus location so that they have access to dining during this tough time. But what we can do is actually take a list of students through our coordinated effort with your campus student information system. We can actually electronically provision, say, a Kroger gift card or a specific series of optional gift cards to a variety of dining locations, which may be on or off campus, but in a time where it's really difficult to service your customer, your student, but they're still learning through remote learning opportunities or options. This is a way that we've stepped in to help schools handle it. I don't know that that's a long-term post-COVID solution, but it's an interesting one that's come to mind right now, given the weird situation that we're all in. Regulatory compliant financial or access to federal financial aid is something that we offer. That's our core business, as well as third-party financial aid management for sponsored payers. And by that, I mean, you know, both need-based and merit-based account types, everything from Veterans Affairs all the way through, all the way through to athletics or other types of fund buckets that a student may have. And before I move on, the one other thing I'll mention is you don't have to use us for all of these things. A number of our UC, University of California schools that started up this past fall, they came to the table and said, we sort of have a solution for federal, so we're not going to touch Pell with this right now, but we really need help because our veterans and vocational rehab and concurrent enrolled students, boy, that's a really difficult process. It's all on paper. So we started by making that process automated. And once they saw our reconciliation reports and how everything worked, and that we weren't just asking them to throw spreadsheets around from department to department, they immediately asked us to do the Pell process as well. So, you know, you may be asking yourself, why do I need this? I already have a process. We pay our financial aid to the students with a check, or, you know, we have a process in place where students can go get a voucher. You know, we're not trying to talk down your existing process. If you have something that works, great. The goal here is to say, you know, maybe we can make it a little bit better so that as a student and a customer in your enterprise or your financial, or I'm sorry, your auxiliary service, I don't have to do some special process or wait in a special line to use my special form of funds, but instead I can just check out like anyone else. And again, I mentioned this before, but what do? We enable financial aid or third-party aid as a tender type at the point of sale. So that includes Title IV funds. As David mentioned before, there are some state rules and things that really come into play as to what you can and can't use that for, when you can use it, and how you can use it. And that's sort of our special sauce on our end, is that we have a rules engine that will allow or disallow these aid types, as well as apply them in the appropriate order. So we exhaust the funds that need to go first and then move on to the next, all without your cashier or your point of sale having to know anything about it. To them, it just looks like approved or declined. So how does that work? Well, on the SIS side, and when I say SIS, I'm referring to a common parlance of student information system. We have a approved and vetted partnership with both Ellucian and Oracle for both Banner and Colleague on the Ellucian side, and PeopleSoft with Oracle. And for anyone who's using or migrating to Workday, we are in talks and working on that as well. And then on the right side of the screen, we have, you know, approved campus merchants. And currently we work specifically in the auxiliary spaces with dining, bookstores, and transportation. But really, we like to call that category approved campus merchants, because if you wanted to approve another merchant, be it an on or off campus merchant, we can work with virtually anyone. The key thing here to remember is that you're in control of who we work with. We don't go and decide who your students can and can't transact with. So, you know, bear in mind that this isn't limited to dining, bookstore, and transportation, but it is also important to remember that sometimes financial aid types are limited to those types of purchases. So we have to stay within the scope of what the funds can be spent on. Well, in a very simple manner, we sit between those two systems. We provide a secure channel of communication, similar to the way that your credit card processor provides a secure channel of communication between your customer and the merchant bank, so that you don't have to look up all of the details and check their credit and see if they have money. The system just does that automatically. And that's what we do, but essentially for student financial aid. Well, what does that look like at the register? Very simple. If you just take this in the context of a dining solution where you have a student and they approach, or I put it in the context of my dining experience at my college, you know, I walk up with a tray and I go to the cashier and they scan my purchases, or they look at what I have and they, you know, key off the different things on their point of sale. Our process requires either the entry of the student ID or the swipe of the student ID, and we use that not to tie into the meal plan or to do anything magical there, but instead to just get the unique identifier for that student, so that we can advance to look up their account in the student information system. And once we have that information, our process kicks off. It happens just as fast, if not a little bit faster now than a credit card, because ever since the advent of chip and signature or chip and PIN, transactions on the credit card now take a little longer. Well, we're starting to beat them in this process, and we do a lot in just a few seconds. So we take that student ID, we look them up in the student information system, we see what aid types they have, we look at what they're trying to buy on the point of sale, and we configure a match of what can and can't happen. And there's 3 potential outcomes with this. First outcome is that they don't have any aid and they weren't eligible. If that's the case, no problem. We're not going to confuse them by asking that question. They just will move on and they'll pay with another tender type. There's also the possibility that they have some aid and it covers a portion or not all of the transaction, in which case the cashier can tell them they have that option to spend it, and the remainder or the non-approved items have to be paid with an alternate tender. And then the third option is it covers all of it. And the cashier would tell the student that, that's like, this is covered by XYZ. Would you like to do that? And they may opt not to. Maybe they have a couple of fresh $20 bills that they got from their parents over the weekend, and they're going to spend those first. I highly doubt that, but as David said earlier, cash kind of is protected. So they would likely say, sure, apply it to my aid type. And then we set the priority based on your campus preference as well as the regulatory preference of what aid type has to be exhausted first, second, and third, and so on, so that we can actually write that charge directly back to the SIS to represent what happened, how much was spent, and to speak for those funds so that they don't get, again, either double spent in another auxiliary across campus or dispersed back to the student. So what happens when it's done? Well, the student departs with their purchase. All of the information relevant to our transaction that just was performed is now written and up to date in the SIS in real time, so that that transaction is complete. And like I said, it can't accidentally go and double spend it now at the bookstore or somewhere else. And each campus merchant, as well as the student information system, is reconciled daily. So we provide a detail as well as a summary report that just shows that, hey, these are all the dining transactions that occurred today on a summary basis. And this is all the dining transaction fees that were written to the SIS. And any accounting folks in the room or anyone who has to deal with an occasional audit would know that it's really nice to know that the reconciliation value comes to 0 and everything matches. So we provide the availability to visibly see that on a daily basis, as well as some other capabilities. If you had, say, an off-campus merchant or a foundation that ran your dining that's separate from your institution, we can go so far as to even move the funds in the same way that your credit card processor drops a batch into the merchant account every day. We can secure that process and pull funds from an institutional account and move them to the merchant account as these reconciliation reports are reviewed and approved. Not required, but again, it makes life a little bit easier in the context of one less thing for your administration to have to deal with at the end of each transaction. So if you do have a point of sale, but it's not one that we work with, or you don't have a point of sale at all and you're still using, say, just high end but not integrated or web enabled cash registers, that's not a problem. We also have a tablet that can be used either as a stopgap until we complete your configuration on campus, or as your final sort of setup to allow for students to be able to have this access to financial aid. And what that looks like from a transaction perspective is very similar to what I think in the industry is referred to as a sidecar, just like a sidecar credit card terminal. Ours is a sidecar tablet to try and check financial aid. And it starts by simply scanning in or swiping or keying in the student ID. And once we have that student ID, we get an answer back from the SIS that says their student name and their ID that we just keyed in. And here we have a mock department category 1. You could just imagine that that might be a category such as prepared food items or prepackaged food items. And the cashier would simply key in the department type, the total amount they're trying to spend, the applicable tax. And the reason we capture the tax is some aid types cover tax, some aid types are tax exempt, and we figure all of that out for you, but we need to know what the transaction total looks like. And once we have that information, we can run our process and say, yep, the success, this is covered. We're going to cover the $15 and the tax is covered too. If it wasn't fully covered, we'd have a message that said partial or failure. And that would let the cashier know that it looks like you have to pay for this one because you don't have any more aid or sufficient aid of the appropriate type to cover this. We also can optionally capture the customer signature, which is important for aid types like Veterans Affairs, and other sponsored account types that require that the student actually sign. And once it's complete, the cashier would just pivot back to their regular point of sale, key in the covered amount and the tax amount, or make the item tax exempt if it wasn't covered, and complete the transaction, either by collecting another form of payment if it was only partially covered, or just saying complete as an alternate tender type and moving on to the next customer. And just as our integration with the point of sale immediately ties this back to the SIS, as too does our tablet solution. So the idea here is that any student with any aid type should be able to approach the register and pay just like they can approach and pull out a cash or check or credit card. Check may be antiquated these days, but cash or credit card are simple, and we try to do the same thing to make it simple so that your cashiers don't have to have a master's degree in financial aid types that are eligible for our sale, and they don't have to hold up the line by explaining what works and what doesn't. We just automate that workflow end to end. So some other things that we're working on for the near future is we do have a test school, a UC school in California that we're going to be starting a EBT SNAP benefits integration with. It involves us and another point of sale provider. And the goal with that project was that, there's nothing that says they have to do this, but the student senate at this campus actually stepped up while the school was looking for their new point of sale solution and said to the administrators, we really don't want to have this process where we can pay with cash or credit card or traditional tender types at the register, but if we have an EBT card, we have to do a separate thing that's different, because boy, that calls us out to all of our peers. It makes it more embarrassing, or it's just more time consuming and quite frankly, frustrating. If you swipe your EBT card and then the cashier says, oh, another one of those, you have to use this machine over here. So the goal with this project was to just make it so that one hardware device could be used for EBT, credit, student ID swipe, virtually any type of card, while still maintaining the requirements for PCI and PADSS compliance, and also while maintaining the very strict rules that come with SNAP benefits and EBT, which allow or disallow certain financial aid types depending on what the customer is trying to buy. And we'll be launching that this fall, and I think it's going to really take off like wildfire in California, because there is just such a heavy reliance on these aid types in that state, and within the UC system. I think it'll be, once one does, many do. But it's not limited to California. We're open to discussing that capability with anyone who's interested in accepting SNAP benefits. And I won't read this, but I think some key takeaways from this other comment on screen here from one of our recent customers prior to installation really hit on all of the points that, we're not telling you that you can't do this already today. Many of you already probably have some sort of solution in place, but it may not be a very comfortable solution for your cashiers or your customers. And this little paragraph that was emailed to me recently by someone who's installing our software, I think hit on those points that, we want students when they get to school to be worried about school, and to worry, if they're going to worry about anything, to figure out how to get into their campus and understand what's going on, not to be waiting in lines or putting off purchases that they should otherwise be doing just like everyone else, but because they don't understand how to do it, or they don't want to go stand in a special line, they put it off, putting themselves at even further risk. So with that, I'll turn it back over to David. Again, I really appreciate everyone taking the time to watch this, and I think there's a Q&A on here, so if anyone has questions, feel free to add those and David can address them, and if something that's relevant to me, I'm happy to either answer it here or get back to you when I have the right answer if it's outside of my wheelhouse.
Thank you, Mike. That was spectacular. Great. That's exactly what we need. Your systems, your technologies, your strategies to close that loop and simplify this payment source to support the success of students on campuses. And it really runs a gambit, because there are some schools that we've worked for, community colleges, where all of the Pell Grant money is deposited into a bank-based account that the students can spend anywhere before they have to spend one penny on tuition or fees or books. And in other cases, clearly it all has to be spent on those other items first, and then they either get the remaining money deposited into a bank-based account where they can use an ATM card anywhere to withdraw money. Some get a paper check still, not too many. But just as an example, we were recently working in a system in a state where there were a number of schools, community colleges, and one of them, just one of them refunded close to $2 million a year in unspent Pell Grant money. Now, if the notion of having Pell Grant money is to aid and support students to be successful on campus, then why in the world wouldn't that money, or couldn't that money, or shouldn't that money be available to support students' ability to keep their hearts and minds working with the nutrition in their stomach in order to do so? We mentioned earlier, and Alex referred to a cashless campus solution that clearly is the form of a mobile app. If there's any common denominator, and there are a number of them in terms of COVID solutions, is to have touchless or cashless transactions. There are a number of apps for that. Grubhub is one of them, and next Thursday we're going to co-present with Ben Anderson from Grubhub on these topics as well for 4-year and 2-year schools. And the ability to have as one of the methods of payment, as Mike referred to earlier, maybe the first go-to method of payment is scanning and determining what sources of financial aid are eligible, what the rules are, executing that transaction, and if not, going to the next available tender. These can also be used with food trucks. Those are part of a solution in terms of retail COVID strategies, and even having the ability to pre-order food or order food through an app in a food truck. Use, again, those methods of payment to provide a little more variety on a campus. And even another COVID strategy are the entryway handoffs. Again, using the mobile app, whether it's a Grubhub or another mobile app, using Mike's payment systems as a way to source those financial aid buckets to pay that, have a touchless, cashless transaction. And then also we mentioned earlier about expanding the hours of operation. You know, on community college campuses especially, or campuses that are predominantly commuter students, there typically is a big peak in demand at lunch, but not so much in the morning or later in the afternoon. There's always a demand, but there's always kind of a conflict between the number of students on campus or faculty and staff to support enough demand to make a venue viable during those hours, let's say between 7 and 11 in the morning, or let's say between 1:30. Could go as late as 10 p.m., depending on whether or not there's a robust continuing ed program on campus. But also the notion of using a ghost kitchen. And if we use the ghost kitchen, where we can have a kitchen without a storefront, or we would have to have a pickup area, but not a dining room or anybody taking orders, using that app or an app to place the order, using Mike's payment system for scholarship money that's eligible to make that payment, and then permitting the student or even the faculty or staff member, because it could be whether it's financial aid or a Visa or a MasterCard or a bank-based debit card, to make that payment transaction complete, cashless, touchless. We really have the opportunity to expand the bandwidth of what's available when the hours of operation are on a community college or a commuter campus, but also the breadth and depth of menu variety and selection through those hours. So that's pretty sound policy right there, an opportunity that's afforded with this technology. Mike mentioned earlier, if you have any questions or comments, please submit them. We'll share those with Mike, and we'll all get back to you. If you'd like to talk more to either Mike or me, we can always reach out. We'll be following up with an email, a follow-up email, if you'd like to schedule a Zoom meeting with Mike and or myself, or the two of us. We'd be happy to connect with you. So thank you all very much. There is also I've got 4 more slides here, where I just want to take a minute to talk about a sister company that we've created about 4 or 5 weeks ago called Porter Strategic Advisors. And it really goes beyond food service. And it talks about how do we keep our campuses, our 2-year schools or 4-year schools safe for returning students in the fall. Kind of answering that one question, and then also answering this question for the campus. how do we mitigate an outbreak? And that's true on a 2-year or a 4-year school. So our company, Porter Strategic Advisors, and we have a website, porterstrategicadvisors.com. We have a webinar. This is only 4 slides or 5. There'll be a full 1-hour webinar next Wednesday at 11 a.m. And there are science-based mission-critical components that include testing, tracing, isolation, self-reporting, using even off-campus facilities for testing, on-campus strategies, class staggering, staging classrooms, one-way directional guides for campus buildings, as well as even hand washing stations and financial modeling. So it's just an opportunity to talk about a broader approach that really is something that evolved to meet the moment, an opportunity to make your campus safer and even more financially stable or stronger, depending on the situation. So I want to thank everybody for participating today. Again, we're going to follow up with you. If any of you have asked questions, we'll respond right after this meeting. And again, we have a series for the next, we'll be doing this weekly through the rest of June, and then we'll announce the series at the beginning of each month. Thank you, everybody, for attending. Thank you, Mike. Thank you, Alex. And we look forward to connecting and talking very soon. Thank you, everybody.